We are celebrating our 30th anniversary this week. So that's a nice way to celebrate, to see him carry the Torah on behalf of the congregation. And that metaphor stands for 30 years. Earlier this week, Beth Israel congregation and its sacred books and Torah scrolls were set aflame. Much of the building in Jackson, Mississippi was reduced to ruins. And miraculously, the Torah scroll that the congregation cherishes, a Torah scroll that survived the Holocaust, survived this fire too, untouched. We are shaken by the news of this arson attack by a neo-Nazi against our sister synagogue. And now we see how hatred once again has led to violence. So to better understand our fears and all the ripple effects of this terrorism, to better understand our responses to this fearful time, let us turn to our Torah. In our Parsha, God tells Moses to go and share with the Israelites my name, and share with the Israelites who are enslaved the fivefold promise that I make this day, to bring them out of their slavery, to bring them out of their fear, to bring them to the land of promise. And then it is written, Velo sham'u el Moshe, mikotze ruach ume avodah kasha. But the people then, the Israelites, could not or would not listen to Moses because of the kotze ruach, the crushed spirit, the shortened spirit of the people, and because of the avodah kasha, the heavy labors of slavery. So what does that kotze ruach do to a human being? What does that dispiritedness do for one who is at risk? And how can we overcome it? How can we find fullness of spirit again? That is the question of the day for so many, including us. More often than not, a crushed spirit is debilitating and keeps us locked in fear and despair. But sometimes a spirit that is threatened can find its way to liberation, to new energy, imagination. Because we are aware of the risk, because we know what is at stake, we can find leaders among us and strengths among us that we never knew we had. When one feels you have nothing to lose, as the people of Iran today may feel, you find new courage and the will to rise up and to hope for more, to dare to dream that something better can yet be created. Rabbi Rachel Barenblatt teaches that this Torah story comes to remind us that kotze ruach, this suppressed spirit, is not the end of the story. Being in dire straits, unable to breathe, unable to focus, hearts and souls unable to hope, is not the end of the story. It is the first step towards liberation. She continues that kotze ruach causes us to cry out. That's where our parasha begins, with God saying, I hear your cry, and I will be with you across the narrow straits out of Egypt. Rabbi Barenblatt admits, I don't actually believe that God needs us to cry out in order for God to take notice of us. It's the other way around. We need to cry out because that is the first step in opening our hearts to God, opening our hearts to hope, to the possibility that things can get better. Our heart's cry now is the first step towards the changes that will lead to eventual liberation. And then we fulfill the words of the psalmists, those who sow in tears will reap in joy. Now, I never heard of Rabbi Perry Nussbaum until this week. And I should have known about him because he and my grandfather knew one another and they had many things in common. They attended Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio in the 1930s. They both served as chaplains in World War II after being ordained as Reform rabbis. They both put civil rights activism at the center of their rabbinates in the 1950s and 60s. And furthermore, I should have known about Rabbi Perry Nussbaum because he comes from Toronto. And his life was shaped, in large measure, by Holy Blossom Temple. He was born in 1908 in Toronto to working-class Eastern European Jewish immigrants, Isig and Adela Nussbaum. And they attended a small Orthodox synagogue. I wasn't able in my research to identify which one, but they can proudly claim him as their own too. After his graduation from Toronto Central High School of Commerce, young Perry was unable to gain acceptance to the Chartered Accountants of Toronto. He attributed this rejection to the fact that he was a Jew. Somehow, and again, in my research, there are gaps. I wasn't able to find how he came to be the secretary to Rabbi Barnett Brickner at Holy Blossom Temple. And then, in time, when Rabbi Brickner saw Perry's talents and aspirations, he encouraged him to apply to Hebrew Union College for rabbinical studies. And that was a pivotal moment in young Perry's life. So during those student years, he maintained correspondences with Rabbi Isserman, who had succeeded Rabbi Brickner. And Isserman's passionate concern for matters of social justice made an impression on Nussbaum. And Isserman became a model for all that would follow. Now, Rabbi Nussbaum, it seems, was not an easy match. After his ordination in 1933, the president of Hebrew Union College, Julius Morgenstern, sent him to serve as far away as possible, a small Reform congregation in Melbourne, Australia. And from there, he roamed from congregation to congregation, never an easy fit, until 1954, when he came to Beth Israel Congregation, the oldest and largest synagogue in the state of Mississippi. It was established in 1860, just before the Civil War began. And Beth Israel was not quite sure what to make of Rabbi Nussbaum's direct and demanding personality. By his own admission, he was never a diplomat. Rabbi Nussbaum landed the position and arrived in Jackson only a few months after the U.S. Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision outlawing racial segregation in public schools. That decision, of course, was a watershed moment in the civil rights movement, and it is celebrated on this Martin Luther King Day weekend. Now, I want to pause for a moment to welcome our Muslim guests who are with us this morning. It means more to us than you realize that you have come to worship with us. We are honored by your presence. We are both strengthened and softened by your friendship, and we pray that God will bless you. Rabbi Nussbaum also believed in interfaith relations. And that was shocking enough for the people of Jackson when he initiated interfaith services, Jewish and Christian, in his town. That rattled the whole city. And he was shaped, of course, by what he witnessed as a chaplain in Nazi Europe. So Rabbi Nussbaum pushed the boundaries again, and began to work with Jackson's Black faith leaders, both in worship and in community service. His congregation at that time expressed their disfavor and threatened that his contract would not be renewed. In the 1960s, when young activists, Jewish and Christian, black and white, came to places like Jackson as part of the Freedom Riders movement to protest segregation on the interstate buses, Rabbi Nussbaum welcomed them. And when some of them, many of them, were arrested and jailed by local authorities, Rabbi Nussbaum tried to organize the other rabbis of the state to visit them, to visit at least the Jewish protesters who were imprisoned. But none of his colleagues would agree to do so. So Rabbi Nussbaum shouldered this burden himself. He drove 150 miles each way to the Parchman State Prison. Each week, he delivered personal supplies and cigarettes and led prayer services for the Jewish prisoners. And perhaps most importantly, he took down the names and the addresses of the activists' families so that he could write them letters, assuring them that their sons and daughters were okay. Although Nussbaum received attention and support from Jews outside of the state of Mississippi for this work, he did not publicize these visits to his congregation, and he made sure to cover every expense down to the penny by himself. We're told later that some of those young people, after being released from jail, before heading home to the north, they made a point of finding Rabbi Nussbaum's home to thank him. In 1964, when the churches of black communities in the region were being bombed and burned, Rabbi Nussbaum helped to found the Committee of Concern, an interracial group of ministers who raised money to rebuild the churches that had been damaged. And then, here's where the story takes a turn, and you know it. In September of 1967, the newly built Beth Israel congregation itself was firebombed by the KKK. And later that fall, just 2 months later, Rabbi Nussbaum's home was also set to torch. Thank God no one was hurt, even though Rabbi Nussbaum and his wife were in the home at the time. And now the Jewish community of Jackson, they would be the ones to rebuild their own house of worship. According to the oral history shared on Beth Israel's website, the leadership of the congregation at that time met quietly and secretly to discuss what could be done. And so they raised $10,000, not naming to the donors what it would be used for, only for the situation. And they gave it to the FBI so that a proper investigation of the local chapter of the KKK could be upheld. Now, the terrorists were never arrested, and the rabbi repeated to tell his people and the press that he was certain that those fires were set by anti-Semitism and not as a reaction to his work in the civil rights movement. I took comfort in researching Rabbi Nussbaum's story. I'm glad to know him, or at least something of his complex character, because we need models of courage today, and we need models of ordinary acts of justice and right. We need imperfect heroes who are not numbed by the fear of the day, who are not paralyzed by lies and injustices that are widespread. Rabbi Rachel Goldenberg writes that when we have been abused or hurt, the way the Israelites were in Egypt, a habitual response can be to take on the identity of victimhood. The Israelites took on the identity of slavery, that was their kotzer ruach, rather than seeing their slavery as a temporary condition that could be overcome. They were paralyzed by it. When we cannot imagine that the suffering can change, when we cannot dream that the suffering will end, we take it on as a part of us. To always see oneself as a powerless victim is a dangerous state of mind and heart and spirit, and that is the warning of our parashah. When we close ourselves off from the places in our lives and in the world where we might seek hope and liberation, when we resign ourselves to a chronic sleepiness that masks the truth that all must see, then, only then, we cannot find the energy to get up and change things. When we numb ourselves out as a way of coping with our own pain, we also find it harder to notice when other people are hurting. When we are in distress, we cannot lift our eyes to see how others are in pain. And so we must drop the identity of victimhood. Permanent victims, if we give in to that kind of identity, we can find ourselves rationalizing our own persecution of others, God forbid. And when our hearts harden against our own pain, we no longer feel the world's pain. And that is the teaching of this parashah, to reject the kotzer ruach, to overcome the shortness of spirit, that dispirited state. And instead, we take up the words of Ezekiel the prophet in our haftarah, Bayom hahu, on that day, I will make the household of Israel strong, and I will give you courage to speak out in the midst of others, in the midst of all. And then they too shall know that I am the eternal God. Amen.
Go out and tell a story.